More death and destruction as emergency responders continue to pull bodies from the devastation of Tropical Storm Timbin that hit the Philippines' second largest city, Mindanao. Flash floods and landslides washed away homes, turning streets into rivers. Dozens are still missing, and rescue workers fear the number of casualties will rise as forecasters predict more heavy rains to bring even more floods and landslides. Families and neighbors stand heartbroken as more bodies are recovered.
The flood was already close and the people were not able to get out of their homes. The flood was so strong that it swept away houses.
Emergency responders say rocks and boulders, some as big as cars, were washed down the mountain and buried scores of homes in the town of Piagapo. More than 20,000 people have been displaced in a region already ravaged by the government's fight against ISIL-linked groups. Aid organizations have criticized the government's response.
This is something that shouldn't be a surprise to the Philippine government and to the Philippines. So it is also very questionable when the government is not prepared to give relief and to give help to the people when these things happen, because they should be ready.
The Philippines is hit with over 24 tropical storms every year. But the island of Mindanao is rarely affected. Timbin struck on Friday with winds over 80 kilometers per hour, hurling mud and rocks from a nearby mountain. Tropical Storm Timbin is now heading over the South China Sea, and forecasters warn it may hit Vietnam by Monday. Mohammed Al-Bardisi, Al Jazeera.
Now to that shooting spree targeting police officers in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania overnight. Investigators asking the public for help as they determine whether this suspect killed by police had ties to terror groups. All this following an incident in California, a man there accused of planning a Christmas Day attack. Here's ABC's Eva Pilgrim with more.
Tonight, authorities in 2 states investigating 2 potential terror plots. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, police trying to determine if a string of shootings targeting law enforcement was an act of terror. Police say 51-year-old Ahmed Amin Al-Mafti attacked police in 3 places. First, opening fire at an officer in this police car. Later, shooting and hitting a state trooper before sparking a shootout with police that ended when he died.
This individual showed that he was not afraid to fire at different law enforcement officers.
Relatives say Al-Mafti, a father of 2, was a U.S. citizen with Egyptian ties. ABC News learning Al-Mafti just returned from a trip to the Middle East mid-October. Tonight, investigators are looking at what he has been doing since he returned to Central PA. This as authorities arrest a suspected ISIS sympathizer in California. Investigators say 26-year-old Everett Aaron Jameson, a tow truck driver and former Marine recruit who was trained as a sharpshooter, was planning a Christmas Day attack. His plan to target crowds using a vehicle, guns, and possible homemade explosives at one of San Francisco's most popular spots, Fisherman's Wharf.
He denied the allegations in the complaint.
In October, 2 FBI undercover agents contacted Jameson after noticing support for ISIS on his Facebook account. The FBI then forced to act quickly, searching Jameson's home in Modesto, California. They say they found firearms and a handwritten note. His father is in shock.
That's not how he was raised.
And Eva Pilgrim joins us now live from Times Square. With ISIS recently encouraging its supporters to commit acts during the holiday season, police are now stepping up security?
That's right, Tom. Security is ramped up across the country at popular holiday destinations. Here in New York, police have shut down some roads, blocked off those roads, and officers are patrolling with their guns on display. Tom?
Eva Pilgrim for us tonight.
Now from Madison, Professor James Fetzer with the University of Minnesota Duluth. Professor, thank you for being with us. The U.S. is saying that the provision of lethal weapons aims at deterring further aggression. How can lethal weapons deter aggression?
Well, this is disgraceful conduct on the part of the United States. The Javelin is a fire and forget anti-tank weapon, meaning it's self-directed. It's a heat-seeking missile, very effective against tanks. But we learned from Barack Obama in 2015 that the United States had spent $5 billion creating unrest in the Ukraine to drive out the democratically elected president by riots in 2013 and a coup in 2014 to install a group that Professor Francis Boyle, an international human rights expert, has described as a neo-Nazi group. This is outrageous behavior. Obama was following the Zbig-Brzezinski line outlined in the Grand Chessboard that the Ukraine is the breadbasket of Russia, so that if you can divorce Ukraine from Russia, you've greatly weakened the bear. This is shameless behavior, especially given the solemn agreements into which the United States entered with Mikhail Gorbachev regarding the dissolution of the Soviet Union, according to which the United States agreed it would make no effort to transform the Balkan nations, the Eastern Bloc nations, into allies of the West. If the Soviet Union were to surrender its control of those regions, we have in fact done precisely the opposite.
And Professor, what is, in your opinion, the solution to the Ukraine problem?
Well, Barack Obama actually claimed that Ukraine had the right to determine its own future. The United States had no business conducting this intervention. The best thing we could do would be to support the Ukrainians to regain control of their own nation. In Iran, of course, we effected a coup in 1953 that deprived the Iranians of their democratically elected government, which they were unable to recapture until 1979. Let me draw a parallel. Suppose that Russia somehow was able to intervene in Canada and bring about a coup and install an anti-American government in Canada and then supply them with sophisticated weapons. The United States wouldn't like that one bit. But Russia hasn't entered into solemn agreements with the United States that would preclude doing that. We entered into those solemn agreements with the then Soviet Union, and we have violated them again and again and again by installing sophisticated weapon systems on the border of Russia. The United States is an unworthy, untrustworthy partner in international affairs, and these actions only further disgrace the United States in the eyes of the world.
All right, thank you for your thoughts, Professor James Fetzer, joining me from Madison, professor with the University of Minnesota, Duluth.
North Korea sounding off after a fresh round of sanctions from the UN Security Council in response to its missile launch late last month. The new sanctions limiting Pyongyang's access to oil and forcing North Korean workers in other countries to return home. The rogue regime calling the sanctions a, quote, act of war and threatening to retaliate against nations who supported them. Joining now is Kieran Skinner, professor of international relations at Carnegie Mellon University, a research fellow at Hoover Institution, and a Fox News foreign policy analyst. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. You know, North Korea seems to call everything an act of war. Every single time we do joint military exercises with South Korea, North Korea calls it an act of war. So, you know, why does Kim Jong-un do this, and at what point are we going to take it seriously?
Well, the newest sanctions are so dauntingly punitive that I think there's nothing else for the North Korean leader to say. Not only are they punitive, but they are unanimous, with much of the world behind the U.S.-led sanctions resolution. And that further isolates the regime. And it will hurt its economy and the ability of the leadership to continue to develop its nuclear and ballistic missile program. So his rhetoric doesn't compare to the reality of what the world has just done.
You know, North Korea also has vowed that every country that voted in favor of the resolution would face retaliation from North Korea. So presumably that would mean Russia and China. What do you make of that?
North Korea is out of options in terms of retaliation because it attempts to play nuclear blackmail. The problem with using that type of lack of diplomacy, if you will, is that you have no other options below. So what can it do to the world but threaten some type of nuclear maneuver that would immediately hurt the Chinese, of which it is attached to territorially. So I think it's just really rhetoric and desperation.
Well, how do you think these sanctions will actually be implemented? Because in the past, the problem is the sanctions haven't been implemented as they were supposed to be by the countries involved.
The fact that we've had numerous now unanimous sanctions resolutions and that the United States is continuing to pressure the great powers that have signed on to the sanctions resolutions like the Chinese and Russians, and given that the fact that the Chinese and Russians are part of the sanctions resolutions, they are the only allies of North Korea, I think speaks to the capacity to get a much more universal compliance with them. But also they hit so many sectors all at the same time that I think their effectiveness will be much superior to ones in the past. Textiles, for example, are now banned. The importing of North Korean textiles. The North Korean workers, more than 90,000, are being recalled home from abroad within 2 years, and they've accounted for additional hard currency for the country. You just go down the list. And I think these sanctions really will work.
That's true, and yet today the AP is reporting that U.S. officials say that, when North Korean coal exports were forbidden, shiploads would basically be channeled through Russia. Sometimes goods and products would be switched from ship to ship out at sea in order to avoid sanctions being implemented.
Yes, there's more ship-to-ship compliance, I think, in the newest round of sanctions because there are ways to check for compliance that didn't exist in the past. But also, the Russians and Chinese simply have much more skin in the game this time because North Korea is so out of control with the development of its nuclear program against prior UN resolutions that the Chinese and North Koreans, the Chinese and the Russians have really taken notice. They don't want an all-out war. It will be devastating for them in addition to the rest of the world.
Well, I should mention that China actually has a defense agreement with North Korea, so it's sort of to be determined what would happen if North Korea were to get into a military action with another country, including the U.S. But I want to bring this up. There's a thought that Kim Jong-un is absolutely unwilling to give up his nuclear program, that he essentially ties that to his own life and to his own staying in power, that he believes that Colonel Gaddafi would still be in place, that Hussein would still be alive if they had nuclear weapons. What do you say to that ideology, that he simply isn't going to give up his nuclear weapons program?
Yes, he's created this dangerous scenario where his regime survival and his own personal survival is tied to his nuclear program. This is an odd type of nuclear deterrence. The problem is that he's got to be able to continually convince the elites in his own country that the whole country's survival is tied to his survival, which is tied to the nuclear program. If there's any break away from him among elites, those in the military, those in China that he depends on, I think then he's taken a risky gambit, and it may not work.
All right, well, we shall see. Kyron Skinner, thank you for your insight today.
Thank you.